Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Hirschfeld, and I would like to welcome you to the February C2ER and LMI Institute monthly webinar. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Council for Community and Economic Research, commonly known as C2ER, and the Labor Market Information Institute. C2ER and the LMI Institute work to improve data availability, enhance its quality, and foster learning about regional economic analytic methods. We do this by conducting training, advocacy, and research. Before we begin, I'd like to touch on a few logistical items. All participants are in listen-only mode, but there will be time at the end of the webinar for a question and answer session. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them in the questions box, which you'll see in the GoToWebinar interface. Feel free to submit questions at any point during the webinar, but we'll hold them until the end of the presentation and then go through them and read them out loud. Now, please help me welcome Messrs. Tim Mulcahy and Josh Borton. Mr. Mulcahy is the Vice President of the Economics, Justice, and Society Department at NORC and Director of NORC Data Enclave. He has nearly 25 years of experience in social science research, developing and implementing complex data-centric projects involving sensitive data, evidence-based research, and data warehousing. Mr. Borton is a senior data scientist at NORC and has extensive experience developing and applying statistical disclosure limitation methods to various types of data, including administrative and survey data in various fields, including medical and education data. With that, Tim and Josh, you have the floor.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Greg. This is Tim Mulcahy. Really pleased to be here today with my co-presenter, Josh Borton. Our presentation is entitled Secure and Disclosure-Safe Data Dissemination and Sharing. The discussion will last about 35 to 40 minutes, and we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So if we could go to the next slide. A little introduction to our organization, NORC. We are, as it states, an independent, nonpartisan research firm that provides data and analysis to state and federal government clients as well as private sector clients with regard to programming and policy decisions. We have our offices headquartered in Chicago, in downtown Chicago, and we also since the 1940s have been affiliated with and on campus at Hyde Park at the University of Chicago. We also have a very large presence here in the DC metro area, and as you can see, we have satellite offices scattered throughout the U.S. In Albuquerque, we have a telephone phone center. We have small offices in Atlanta and Boston and San Francisco and in the Silicon Valley, and we just recently opened a new call center in Wichita. So one of the things I think that's really important to note that distinguishes NORC from our competition is really this close affiliation that we've had with the University of Chicago, as I mentioned, since the 1940s. Not only do University of Chicago faculty work on various projects and go after certain pieces of work and proposals with NORC staff, it also happens the other way around, that we collaborate with the university on various initiatives. Also noteworthy that more than half of the NORC trustee board is affiliated with the University of Chicago, and also that we have a number of different what we call academic research centers that are housed on the main campus there at the university. So we are an organization that spans across a number of different departments, from, as I mentioned, the academic research centers to my department in economics, justice, and society. We also have a heavy emphasis on health with a healthcare department, a health sciences department, and a public health department. We also have an education and child development department, an international program, and we have an excellent no pun intended, Center for Excellence in Survey Research, as we call it here, CSER, which works hand in glove with our statistics and methodology group. You see that we have 5 different sort of research areas that these departments span across: economics, markets, and the workforce, education, training, and learning, global development, mostly with our international group, and then health and well-being, and society, media, and public affairs. So in terms of what we do, we are data-centric. We are in the business of ingesting confidential data and repurposing those data to create various reports for our clients, memos, and this sort of thing, doing various aggregation of data and reports, and actually developing whether it be public use or restricted use data sets for our clients. Unsurprisingly, in working with sensitive data, one of the most important things, obviously, that you need to keep your focus on is protecting the identity of the respondent or the household or the firm or whatever entity makes up the underlying microdata. And so it's important that we are on top of and keep current with all the different laws and mandates that follow data, from CIPC to high-tech to HIPAA to FISMA and the Privacy Act and such. There's a number of different legal parameters that guide the use of our data. And obviously, it's part and parcel to our 75-year reputation to make certain that we are doing our due diligence in protecting and safeguarding data confidentiality. So we're going to talk today, Josh and I, about 2 what we're calling complementary privacy protection methods. There are numerous methods, but the 2 major ones we're going to focus today on are security and disclosure limitation. Josh will go into the disclosure limitation piece momentarily. I will focus briefly on the security part of this. And in terms of security, we're talking about things like limiting who can actually access the data. That's a vetting process, or what we call trying to focus on safe people and safe projects. And then there are ways for us just to make the process that much more seamless and protected by providing not direct access to all of the underlying microdata in a certain data set, but rather can also just provide specific data views for those pieces of or variables that the researcher or research teams need to be able to do their analyses. We can also do things like just remove obvious identifiers, Social Security number and such. We can also put together various statistical methods to protect the data, so data perturbation, suppression methods, and this sort of thing. And then, as I mentioned on the last slide, we also provide what we call limited or restricted statistically protected data sets. So these are data sets that can be anywhere from a public use data set where they're perfectly protected to one that maintains a certain level of the actual underlying microdata and needs to be protected in various restricted forms. Okay, so when we talk about data security, as I mentioned, the idea here is to make sure we're limiting access to only those people that actually need that data. And again, limiting views where possible, just again to make certain that we're focused on protecting the data. In addition to safe people and safe processes and safe projects, it's important to have a safe data center as well. So what we do here at NORC is we have what we call an NORC data enclave. This is a secure remote access data platform that has been in the works since 2006. We have the potential for researchers to come in and work with various data that they are authorized to work with in an environment with statistical and programming tools, as well as a collaborative environment to be able to collaborate with various researchers. And it's important to recognize that this is a closed environment, and that's why it is and can be called, you know, a secure model. That there is no port to the internet. That everything that comes into or out of the environment needs to be reviewed by data custodians or statistical data control analysts like Josh. And one of the things that we found was particularly, I think, relevant today was a new technology or methodology, really, that Josh and his team have developed over the last couple of years in disclosure limitation called XID. I'm not going to steal his thunder. There's a good bit of this. The slide is going to focus specifically on this. I think at a high level, what we are talking about here is being able to maximize the utility, the data utility of the various data holdings that we have, while also protecting them to a point that is safe. And he does that through various ways of aggregating the data and treating the microdata, and also working with various different data structures, and to the extent that's possible, automating the application of these techniques. Now, the NORC Data Enclave, as I said, has been in business for more than 10 years. We have clients in the federal and state government sector and also in the private sector. They all share one common need, which is to be able to store huge confidential data sets and be able to provide authorized researchers access to those data. So the point here is that no longer are we advocating for data to move from one place to another. It's just the opposite. Those are all potential breach points, and the beauty of the enclave is that once you develop this secure platform, we move the data in and it doesn't move again. It stays protected in this environment, and what we do is we move in safe researchers through safe nodes to come in and have various views on the data. So this is the best way to optimize both the security of the environment and also be able to give as wide an access to confidential data as possible. You'll notice here that we have two ways of really offering our business offering. One is researchers coming in double firewall within NORC's existing network, and then being able to access the data they have authorization to. We also have clients who are having us ingest an enormous amount of data and then do various validation exercises to clean the data and prepare the data to create information products from data using various mechanisms and business intelligence tools here, as you see in the middle of this graph. And then finally, to the far right, you can see how we have our storage component and our file repository, both with our SQL Server and all the different pieces that make up our metadata-driven solution. So in looking at the available information that we had out there, we saw that this particular effort, the State Policymaking and Program Evaluation Initiative funded by RWJ, looked like one project in particular that had a very nice crossover to the types of things that we're doing and the types of expertise that we bring to the table. As the slide says, we were pleased to see this, to see that some of the work that you're doing is aligning really closely with the types of interests that NORC has. And we look forward not only to having this conversation today more widely, but also to have maybe a more detailed discussion later on down the road on how we might be able to help in that particular context. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Josh Borton to talk about disclosure limitation and specifically NORC's XID methodology.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you, Greg, and C2ER and LMI for having us today. Tim and I are both very interested in kind of not so much moving data around, like Tim said, but making data available in as useful and a safe way as possible to as many people or as many researchers as possible. So it's fun to talk about this topic. So I'm going to talk about the disclosure limitation work that we're doing here at NORC, which falls under the kind of umbrella of NORC XID disclosure limitation practice. Let's see. I'm trying to, there we go. So just to outline what I'm going to cover here, I'm going to talk about kind of a very brief intro to disclosure limitation, talk about some definitions, some methods and vulnerabilities, kind of a baseline disclosure limitation techniques, and then a little bit about the research we're doing into advancing techniques at NORC. And then I'll finish up with some what I'm calling example implementations, which are essentially kind of the marrying of the security aspect and the disclosure aspect in varying ways that can kind of meet different demands. And I'm going to, in all of this, I'm going to very much try to kind of stay out of the weeds of the mechanics as far as like how we want to operate on data, and more focus on kind of the end result and how different types of disclosure limitation strategies and implementations work together, and how that looks to the data provider, and most importantly to the data user as far as what they can get out of the data while remaining compliant with privacy restrictions. So to get started, what is disclosure? Primarily, there in the literature, there are kind of two primary types of disclosure: re-identification, which also gets called identity disclosure, which means identifying a record as belonging to a known individual. And then once you do that, if you're looking at some kind of microdata, and you can tell that a record is associated with a particular person, then anything else that's on that record you also learn. And here we refer to as the outside entity as the intruder. So everything, once a person's re-identified, everything else on that data record in that data set is learned by the intruder. Then there's also attribute disclosure, which is a little bit less specific, and that's where the intruder learns a particular piece of information about an individual, or even a small group of individuals. An example being is that it might be possible to learn someone's income from a table showing wages within an organization by some basic demographics, and if only one person kind of fit that demographic profile and the table showing mean wages, then you might learn that person's wages. That's kind of just one simple mechanism by which attribute disclosure can occur. But basically, re-identification, you learn the whole thing. Attribute disclosure, you may be only learning one or two pieces of information about an individual. So, what's the first line of defense in keeping this type of thing from happening? And there's a lot of stuff that anybody would think of first, and this is obvious, is that you're going to remove direct identifiers, names, identification numbers, phone numbers, social security numbers, all these addresses, all these types of things that obviously identify an individual. And this can usually be referred to as anonymization. The other top-of-mind idea that most people will go to is that it's like, fine, we don't need to share all this record-level information. We're just going to share a bunch of tables that describe the population by cross-tabulations that we're interested in, and that removes the possibility of re-identification because you're not sharing any unit-level data. And this can be very effective, when the dimensions of interest are well known and there aren't, say, cross-tabulations that people come up with that you're not presenting. But each one of these kind of top-of-mind solutions are vulnerable and kind of become more complicated fairly quickly. So with anonymized data, I'm sure most people listening today are aware that even once you remove direct identifiers, there very likely will be enough other variables in your anonymized data that may also exist. That same combination of variables may exist in an external unidentified data source, which would allow someone to match to your anonymized data and identify at least a portion of the records on this anonymized data set. It's been pretty well documented that combinations of gender, race, zip code, and date of birth in many populations can be highly unique. So if someone has even a partial listing of your data and can match up to a data source with this, it's a possibility that they may be able to connect identities with the anonymized data. It's also possible that that kind of a super identified external data source could be assembled from multiple external data sources, some of which may be identified and not, to create a very kind of large vector of matching variables that could be matched to your anonymized data file producing even more re-identification than might have been anticipated. And this gets referred to as the Mosaic Effect, this piecing together of disparate data sources into kind of a longer identifying data source. So what's often done to combat this, once you've kind of possibly identified your other, we'll call them pseudo-identifying variables, is that people may suppress some of these variables or recode them to make them less precise and therefore less matchable to these external data sources, or possibly use local suppression of particular values or variables for subsets of the population that seem to be more vulnerable to this type of matching, such as like a minority race or a sparsely populated zip code or something like that. So that's kind of the next level of how anonymized data moves closer to being de-identified data and some of the challenges that are there. So then aggregated data, once you kind of look at those problems, it's like, oh, well, let's just not even present person level or case level data. Let's just show aggregate tables that communicate what we're interested in, you know, such as wages by age and zip code and things like that. And then since we're not sharing observations, re-identification can occur. However, you still are prone or vulnerable to attribute disclosure because of small cells. You know, obviously a cell that's populated only by one person is still just communicating information about that one person. But even cells with, you know, more than one but a small number of people can lead to attribute disclosure. And, you know, once people become aware of that, they're like, well, you know, we just won't share information about these small cells and we'll suppress them. And this is, you know, there's usually some kind of a rule put in place, like a minimum. A cell has to have contributions from at least 5 cases or 10 cases. We'll suppress those cells, but then in order to make sure that those cells can't just be algebraically rederived from marginals of the tables and other cells within the table, other cells that are larger than the minimum also need to be suppressed in order to protect those cells, and this is called complementary suppression. And then as you grow in number of tables and multidimensional tables, this can become a challenging question as well. So, but that kind of lays down the challenges of you know, of protecting privacy, you know, in microdata files and even in aggregate tables. You know, and then this is kind of where people like me come in, is, you know, that you understand that any time you're modifying the data to reduce the disclosure risk, be it by, you know, recoding and suppression within microdata or cell suppression in tables, you're also affecting the analytic utility, you know, of the data by making it less precise or not presenting data about some of the individuals within the data. You know, and then so the primary objective of statistical disclosure limitation is to understand and quantify this relationship between risk and utility and essentially find an acceptable compromise between the two objectives. And you'll notice I just say an acceptable compromise. Sometimes I used to say an optimal compromise, but that, I think that's sometimes not. That's a grand aim, but the main thing is to just find something that's an acceptable, that meets your disclosure requirements and pleases or meets your data users' analytic requirements. So then that kind of leads into the work I've been doing with others here at NORC by trying to develop methods, you know, where we're focusing on developing methods that assign a quantity for risk and utility, because once you have that quantified, it's much easier to understand that balance and then also understand the repercussions of some choices and get an idea of what economy you're working in. Because I always think of it as, you know, you're trying to buy as much disclosure, you're trying to meet your disclosure risk requirement and spend as little utility as you can, or at least not spend any more utility than your budget, essentially. And that's really kind of the key central idea of you know, what we're doing. And then another key idea is once we started thinking, you know, in this space, is that we started to realize that microdata is very difficult to make disclosure safe. One, because it relies on assumptions about intruder knowledge, which could change over time or be difficult to know. But also because it's difficult to do in a way that once you start making more and more conservative assumptions about intruder knowledge so that you're very comfortable in your disclosure safety, you might find that you've degraded your analytic utility to the point that it becomes really questionable that it's going to be useful to anybody that's trying to use it, or at best it's going to be frustrating for them, and it's going to shed a lot of doubt on the inferences that they're getting from the data if you kind of over-treat the data in order to be 100% confident that your disclosure risk is adequately low. So to get away from kind of that trade-off that we thought was a bad bargain, we decided that data needs to be aggregated in some way in order to be disclosure safe in a way that doesn't degrade the utility to what we thought was an unacceptable level. And there's kind of two strategies that we take in the methods that we've developed here. The one strategy relies on traditional aggregation, kind of the same idea that's put in place during cross-tabulation and table building. And then the other idea is alternative data structure, which is based on small kind of arbitrarily formed aggregates, which are termed microgroups. And if you've ever heard me speak about some of this before, it's a methodology that we've written up that's called ALPUF, which is the aggregate level public use file. Just for reference, if anyone's heard me speak about this before. I'm going to go over on a very high level on how these strategies play out in terms of, and this is from the perspective of the data producer and the data user, and this is really primarily in terms of the data producer and the choices they're making when they're trying to, say, choose a method for producing a disclosure safe data product. Now I'll just kind of break these down in terms of the utility, how they're specified, and then the trade-offs. So in strategy one, where we're using traditional aggregation, so essentially the engine of this type of disclosure limitation methodology is the idea of cells and suppressing small cells. So on the output side of this, on the utility, this type of method using the traditional aggregation, it provides true values about cohorts of interest where the data allows. Essentially, so most of the time, if the cohort is large enough, it's going to provide a precise value that describes that cohort. And then alternatively, it's going to provide estimates for cohorts or cells that are too small. And again, that number can be somewhat arbitrarily set, but we can't evaluate its impact on the risk and utility within this concept. But then for cohorts that are termed too small, we're going to return an estimate instead. So this is kind of an improvement on that idea of cell suppression, except that now instead of just suppressing a cell and saying you can't know that cell, we're going to deliver an estimate, which is basically just based on all the available disclosure safe data, and then we're going to kind of give the best available estimate that is allowed to be known given the disclosure limitations within the data. So in order to specify this type of treatment, it requires the data producer to specify every allowed cohort. So essentially every cross-tabulation cell that you're going to allow to be known to the data user. There's also specification that goes into essentially the suppression strategy that goes into place when there are cohorts that are too small and how the process deals with them. So basically, going to the trade-offs is, the positive is that you get to share precise values when the data allows. The trade-off is that the specification step, especially in high-dimensional data, can be pretty burdensome and long. But once it's done, it's finished, and you can produce the data product. But there can be a lot of kind of conversation that goes into that specification. And then also from the user side, if somebody is interested in a cross-tabulation or a cohort that's not in the pre-specified list, then they don't have any way of getting at that other than going back to the data producer and saying, next time you produce this product, I would appreciate it if you cross these 5 dimensions and at least apply, supplied estimates for those. So that's the idea of producing a data product that's built upon the idea of traditional aggregation. The other strategy is what I was calling the alternate data structure, and the additional utility of the alternate data structure is that it can provide the user with estimates for any cohort of interest. And what will happen is that small cohorts will have estimates with large expected error, and this expected error will be communicated to the user. And this error will, by necessity, be large in order to protect against disclosure. But then as cohorts get larger and the analytic question becomes more valid because it is based on a larger number of observations, then the expected error with that estimate will become small and then much more useful to the data user. And the way this is done, when I say the alternative data structure, is that basically it goes back to that idea that, well, we can't share microdata, so let's share the next best thing. So what we do is that we form aggregates that are just large enough, and these are arbitrarily formed aggregates that are just large enough to protect against essentially re-identification and direct disclosure, but then they're also small enough that they can essentially be manipulated just like in a similar way to microdata. And in fact, doing analysis with these microgroups is very similar to using weighted survey data, as each microgroup represents a number of underlying microdata records, and the analysis operates like weighted analysis used for all types of surveys. So getting to the specification and trade-offs, the specification is much simpler than in the traditional aggregation because you don't have to pre-specify aggregates, and you don't have to make decisions regarding how would we prefer suppressions to occur because they're not going to happen. So there are essentially some other specifications that go into the execution of the process. And once those specifications are set and we find an acceptable balance between risk and utility, we're done with the specification. So it's a much less onerous process up front. And so we save on specification time, and we also gain analytic flexibility for the user because the aggregates are arbitrary and you can really define whatever cohort you're interested in. The trade-off or the cost is that anything that comes out of this process is an estimate. Again, a bad estimate for a small cohort, or an estimate with a lot of error for a small cohort, and an estimate with much less error for larger cohorts. But everything is an estimate. There are no precisely true values that come out of using strategy 2. So then the application of these processes, these can be applied to both static and dynamic data products. So when I say a static data product, I'm talking about, published tables, either, within a book or on a web page or something like that. Some types of public use files where people can perform some analysis on these. This would obviously have to be with the alternative data structure, but it's something that's static and is just published for consumption. But then the same methodologies can also be applied to what I'll call dynamic data interfaces, like within a secure data environment and query engines and table builders. And it's kind of how these processes interface with a dissemination strategy that I'm going to talk about in the example implementations, where again, these are kind of, I couch these in terms of the tools that NORC has, but these are also just conceptual ideas about how you can piece together security and disclosure limitation in a number of different ways to try to fit dissemination goals and also the demands of your data user community. Okay, so I've kind of set up this continuum where on the left we're using disclosure limitation only. We're not using any kind of secure access. So we're basically, what I was saying before, we're publishing some sets of tables, such as table books, websites, any other type of almost hard copy type of aggregate data dissemination strategy. And public use files would be the microdata version of that. We might even use some of the kind of simpler techniques I was talking about before, where we're just kind of using suppression of variables and values and other kinds of recoding to make a public use file that can be used for some things. You just download it and use it and you're done. That's kind of at the far left of this spectrum, which obviously, once it's out there, it's static, so there's limited user flexibility. So that's one end of our continuum. On the other end of the continuum is secure data access, something that could be accessed within the enclave or some other type of secure environment, or just data residing on one computer that you have to come and use. Or it could be secured remote data access where people can log in. But so you've got this is maximum flexibility for the user, right? Other than the fact that they can't have it on their own machine. They can see the data, they can basically execute whatever they want on the data within an environment like that, even be able to collaborate with other users within the same environment, even share their own private data, combined data sets, and it's all the privacy concerns are taken care of because it's in an environment that they're certain can't be viewed by unintended parties. The problem is that once you get to the point where you've built a great model or find the truth that's lying in the data, unless that's all you needed to know, you need to share these results with the outside world at some point. So at that point, you're going to need some type of disclosure limitation on any type of export of analytic results. So that's when we start to kind of move between the two endpoints of the continuum and consider how the disclosure limitation and secure access work to actually get this information out. So kind of the first step away is that that we can export requests. The export request can be manually reviewed. Again, now obviously all your exports still need to be aggregated in some way. Like it's never going to be okay to export microdata records. But so all these exports are aggregate analysis, tables, models, etc. And usually, what the export will be the approval of the export to leave the secure environment is going to be rule-based and basically will rely heavily on suppression and recoding to make sure that you meet these rules, such as you can't have an estimate that's based on fewer than 10 or 30 observations. And depending on the data source, there can be a number of rules that essentially need to be executed on any export. And the burden of checking out these rules against the export falls on to both the data user and the reviewer. In most setups, the user is going to be aware of the rules, and they're told if you want to get anything out of here, these are all the things that you need that you need to make sure that basically your export does not do. The user will do that. Then they will send it to a reviewer. The reviewer will check for the same things, and then if everything's kosher with the rules, it will be exported. Or it may get the reviewer may find something and send it back to the user, and they'll work this out. I think the limitations of this are pretty clear in that this type of setup is really only going to work for a fairly small user community, as there's a lot of labor both on the user side and on the reviewer side to protect against disclosure. It's also very labor intensive on the reviewer side, and of course, because it's basically relying on inspection, it can be prone to human error. So then, as we move a little bit further away towards the middle here, is that we can have secure access with automated export. Here, the analytic export is passed through some type of automated disclosure limitation process. The analytic flexibility of being within the secure access environment is maintained, and the user still has direct access to the microdata. So in this type of implementation, the alternative data structure could be used in an automated fashion to produce this type of output. In this case, the export would be an estimated version of the results produced within the secure environment. But for adequately sized cohorts, the error will be small. So one kind of artifact of this user experience is that let's say someone builds a model within the secure access environment. They've just been operating on the raw data in the environment. Now, if they want to send if they want to export that model, it's going to go through the automated process. And because of the automated process from the alternate data structure, the precise values of those estimates is going to change some due to the disclosure limitation process. However, if the cohorts, if the estimates are built on decent sized cohorts, the change in that estimate should be fairly small, as the expected error would be fairly small, and this will all be communicated to the user as well, and it's a qualification placed upon that output. So then the next step is if there's an environment, let's say you don't want to manage all this access to a secure data environment, or you have a subset of users or a different use community that wants access to the data, but for whatever reason, due to cost or other limitations, you don't want to give them secure data access to the microdata. Another alternative is what I'll call query access with automated export, in which basically the user is now going to sit outside of the secure access environment, but they're going to query the data, via code submission. So they're basically going to be asking questions of the data, building models, building tables, in the same way that they would within the environment. Really the only difference is that they can't see the actual microdata. They can only execute code against it and see the results. So the same analytic flexibility is retained. The one difference is that the user would never see like say we're taking the same user building the model I was talking about before. Now when they're outside and they have query access, they're never going to see the exact model that was built upon the code. They're only going to see the model with the estimated coefficients because it's gone through the disclosure limitation process. But the thing I want to stress is that the output from both the access on the inside versus access on the outside, the output that they're able to share, in a paper or with anybody that doesn't have access is exactly the same. That they're going to see the exact same model. And then finally, one more move away from the flexibility of the secure access and limiting the flexibility even more is that you could do what I'll call a table builder, where the user can request tables based on pre-specified choices. There's a list of 10 or 12 dimensions, and they can be crossed in maybe a certain number of ways, and not all the crosses may even be allowed. But it does allow for kind of a simplified interface for someone that doesn't want to write code. And then the other thing that changes here, because you are limiting the flexibility of the questions that can be asked, you could use the traditional aggregation methods in this spot, but the same trade-off would apply. So for a table builder, you could use the alternative data structure, and people could arbitrarily, or they could use the dimensions provided in the table builder and build whatever table they want. And every cell and every table would be an estimate. Or you could specify a method using the traditional aggregation method. When cohorts were adequately large, they would get precise values, and then when they were too small, they would be getting estimates. So this is kind of an example of delivery method or interface to the data can be serviced by different types of disclosure limitation methodologies, kind of depending on the priorities of the data provider. So in review, hopefully those examples were useful to everyone. But in review, data security and disclosure limitation are the foundation of responsible and effective data dissemination. As we've said, security ensures that only the right people see the data. Disclosure limitation ensures that only the desired facts are learned from the data, and nobody is accidentally learning information about one or two people that was not the intent of the data. And that that quality dissemination implementations use both of these concepts in concert to achieve dissemination goals. So I want to thank thank Greg and C2ER and LMI for having both Tim and I. And that if people have questions, you can certainly get our emails through Greg. Also, Steve Brown, our partner here at NORC, is coordinating a lot of this outreach work, and if you were to call him and talk to him about your dissemination or disclosure needs, he would put you in contact with me or Tim or any other appropriate person at NORC to discuss pretty much anything within this realm. We'd be happy to talk to you. So thanks again. I'll open it up to Greg and questions from anyone.
Yeah, thanks. We'll now begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. We don't have a ton of time, so I'll ask the questions we have, and then if you have any more, obviously, again, you can contact me, you can contact Tim or Josh, or contact Steve Brown on the slide. But our first question, you mentioned CREC's multi-state data sharing initiative earlier. Could you expand on how you think some of what you discussed today could be applied to that type of work?
Josh, you want to take the first shot at that?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say there's definitely two aspects of that. I mean, when I look at that, I do see how one interesting way that I think the concepts we're talking about could service this, and I kind of imagine multiple states wanting to collaborate within an environment where all their data is secure, but it's even possible that some states may not want to allow researchers from other states, or are not allowed, I mean, statutorily, to maybe allow someone from outside the state or outside the department to see that data. I think if you moved all this data within something like the data enclave, and then use some of these disclosure limitation methods, it would allow people to marry these data sets from different organizations and get good analytic results, publishable analytic findings, while never actually having to allow researchers from outside the organization to see data in a way that may not be allowed due to state regulation or other privacy concerns.
And if I could build on that, thanks for that, Josh. We have a use case already that is worth putting on the table today, and this is a contract we have with the Administration for Children and Families at HHS called the Family Self-Sufficiency Data Center. So this is an effort, we're in year 4 of a 5-year grant to work with states to do just that, find ways to be able to take their administrative data, whether it be TANF or SNAP data, for example, put it into the enclave, you put it into some of the various analytical tools that we have in the enclave, and show states what they can do with their own data. And then the next step in the near future would be for states to be able to compare themselves to other states in a secure manner, so that they would not be able to get at the actual underlying microdata, but we could aggregate the data up in various ways that we could have state-by-state or regional comparisons.
Great. Our next question, what was NORC's original motivation to develop the data enclave and this suite of data services?
Well, it goes back more than 10 years. Actually, it goes back to 2002, in December of 2002, where the federal government passed the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiencies Act, SIPSI, which I referred to earlier, one of the legal framework conversations. There was a mandate, an unfunded mandate to the federal statistical community to make confidential data available to quote-unquote authorized researchers in one way, shape, or form, and there was no real guidance other than that directive, and there was no funding attached to that. So we at NORC took the lead on writing various papers and publishing journal articles around this topic, and in one of our publications to the Journal of Official Statistics that Norman Bradburn and Myron Straff authored, we essentially challenged the federal government that if they weren't quote-unquote up to the task of funding and providing guidance, then surely the private sector would do so. And after about a year and a half of trying to get our arms around this, we finally at NORC decided that we should take the leap and do this. And we won a competitive contract from the National Institute on Standards and Technology, who many on the phone or the conference call today, the webinar today probably know, literally write the book on IT security. They shepherded us through the process of standing up our secure environment and then certified and accredited us for the first 8 years of our existence.
Great, thanks. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for the Q&A session. If anyone has any additional questions, again, please feel free to forward them to me, to Tim and Josh, or to Steve Brown, as contact info is listed on your screen. I just want to say thank you to Tim and Josh for such an interesting presentation. The full webinar will be made available on the C2ER and the LMI Institute websites within the next few days. As soon as they are available, we send out a follow-up email to all attendees with links to download the recording and slides. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and participating in today's webinar. And I hope we'll see you at one of our upcoming webinars or training programs. Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.